Good evening, everyone. My name is Jen Maxey. I am the Director of Public Programs here at the Holocaust Museum LA. I want to welcome everyone. This is going to be a super fascinating talk. James, thank you for coming all this way to, debut your book with us here. Some of you may know that Shanghai was actually really central and critical to accepting and welcoming Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. So where other countries were sort of limiting and saying no or restricting numbers, Shanghai was very welcoming. You did not need a visa for a lot of the 1930s. No visa, the port was free. So consequently, thousands and thousands of Jewish refugees from the Holocaust ended up in Shanghai. So there's that community. But before that even, there's a rich history in Shanghai of Jewish communities from Iraq, the Sephardic Jewish community that came in, I think about the 1930s, James. And then, of course, from Russia, there were a lot of Jewish people. So these are some of the inhabitants of James's story and the history, because this, of course, is before the Holocaust when his story takes place, the story that he's going to tell you, which is a true story. So we have a great interest in this community, and we're so honored that James Zimmerman is here with us. He's lived in China for 25 years. He has served 4 times as the director of the American Chamber of Commerce in China, so he knows a tremendous amount about business in China and about all of the communities in China. And he is joined today by Julie Kessler, who herself is sort of a world traveler, a journalist, an attorney. Julie has written for, the LA Times, the San Francisco Examiner, Money Inc., on, and I know she'll tell you a little bit more about herself when we get to that. But we're thrilled to have these 2 really important people with us today who are going to tell you about this incredible story. Thank you to our friends at Chevalier Books. So please buy a book today. Support this wonderful little bookstore here in Los Angeles. Come on in, sir. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to James and Julie, and we'll get started. So we'll do about 45 minutes, take some questions. Please buy a book. There's wine, there's water, there's cookies for you. And we're just happy you're here. So thanks for being here.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the LA Holocaust Museum. I was asked to moderate this event, I think mainly because I managed to marry my first career as a transactional lawyer with that of my love of travel. In that context, I've traveled to about 110 countries, and for various newspapers, I've interviewed several foreign Supreme Court justices around the world, including Dahlia Dorner, who was a Supreme Court justice, as well as a presidential candidate in Israel. I've also written extensively about travel in all of its forms for the LA Times, the San Francisco Examiner, the Asia Times, and several other major media outlets, including about the Jews of Shanghai, the Jews of Burma, the Jews of Tasmania, and many other locales where you can't imagine there would be Jews, but there were, and there are. We're very pleased to welcome attorney and author James Zimmerman. As many of you know, and those who don't, he's been, as Jen said, resident in Beijing for 25 years, and has been a partner with the international law firm of Perkins Coie. His presence here tonight to discuss his book, The Peking Express, The Bandits Who Stole a Train, Stunned the West, and Broke the Republic of China, is a great honor. The stories that he will share, however, tonight are important in general, not just for students of history and for people who love travel, but in particular to those interested in Jewish culture, its impact on the world. Of particular note, the expatriate legal community could not be more proud and more pleased that you have penned this wonderful book. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. James Zimmerman, who will now give us an overview of this really fascinating story.
Thank you, Julie. First, I want to thank the Holocaust Museum Los Angeles for supporting the opportunity to be here and to chat with you, because it's not just an interesting story, for those that are interested in China, but it's also a story that is part of a lot of families, including we have with us tonight the descendants for Leon Friedman, who was one of the hostages that was held for 37 days. So having the family here, yeah, it's wonderful because first they supported the writing project. And as I was doing my research and writing, but also because it is part of their family history. It's a real history about, their, about the Friedman family that, goes back from the days when when the Friedman brothers left Romania and went to the U.S. and then eventually made their way to China. And it's very, very interesting history. And I'm going to talk more about Leon Friedman in a minute, but we're really fortunate to have the Friedman family here with us tonight. So thank you for being here. So, but anyway, just a little bit of background. This is a train story. It's a story of China's great train robbery of 1923. It's pretty much forgotten in history, and part of that may be because of the invasion of China by Japan in the 30s, World War II, the Civil War that China went through, the Cultural Revolution, the takeover by the Communist Party, and pretty much a lot of things in the 20s is forgotten. And when I started my research, I was actually writing another story. And came across many of the characters in the book. And the more I dug through government records, government archives, I realized that this is a story that has not been told in full from the perspective of all the different players, meaning, not just the hostages, but also from the perspective of the rescuers and the negotiators. And so there was a lot of people that were involved in this. And so in my research, it took me beyond government records in China, London, U.S., and then I started tracing families. The families of those that were involved as hostages, families of rescuers, of the bandits themselves. And the more I dug into this, I realized is that this is really, it's not just a train story, but it's a people story about how all of these different people came together, and survived a 37-day hostage crisis. But it's just a little bit of background. It was a troubling time for China. 1923 was what we call the warlord era, where there was a revolving door of warlords every year. It seemed like there was a new warlord that would come into power. And in 1923, they had a warlord that actually was a reformist, and he was someone that people felt that there was hope for. And, he wanted to have a national constitution. He actually wanted to do away with the warlord system. But his job was very, very challenging because the warlords themselves at the provincial and local levels did not want to give up power. And what they ended up doing was just fighting one another. And when they fought one another, when one warlord would prevail over another, then you had a lot of disbanded soldiers that they didn't know what to do with. They were armed men that were going around the countryside creating issues. They were looking for jobs, looking for food. And then rather than addressing the issues, basically the warlords themselves were just attacking, the so-called bandits. They labeled these disbanded soldiers as bandits. And so it became, a very fractured situation within the country. In the meantime, you have a central government that's trying to drive development, drive the railroad, for economic reasons. They saw the railroad as a way of supporting not just the economy and commerce and tourism, but also the roads were a way to unify this, the fractured country. So that's kind of like the situation, that China was in, the political environment, the economic environment at the time. But you had, the train system, the express trains going from Shanghai to Peking, which was actually a technological marvel at the time. It was a big deal. It was a huge deal because they wanted to unify the country. And then the government themselves invested significantly in the railroads, not just with not just with the tracks and the cars and the stations, but they poured a lot of money into this because they felt this is a way to bring people from Shanghai to Peking to Tianjin and other parts, of the nation. I mean, keep in mind before the express trains, it was a 5-day journey. It was 5 days by ocean-going vessel from Shanghai to Peking. So this was a big deal, and they just started this express service January 1 of 1923. But all of these passengers, and I'll go into details about the passengers, but, at the Shanghai Nanking Railway Station, you had 300 passengers getting ready to board this train to go from Shanghai to Peking, and they had no idea what they were up against. And something that what would confront them in the middle of the country in what was considered to be bandit country. That's a little bit of background, but I can go into if you have questions on the characters.
Oh, I have so many questions. It was really a marvelous book. Just to give a little bit more context, in the late 19th and 20th century, Shanghai was so good for business and was not only a safe haven and an open port. There were 40,000 Jews had emigrated there into other Chinese cities. So these were a lot of numbers, and including merchants from India and Iraq and refugees escaping European and Russian pogroms. So by 1923, the population of Shanghai was about 2 million Chinese and about 35,000 expats living there. Okay, so let's talk about the Shanghai cousins.
Yeah.
All right. The Elias brothers, Freddie and Eddie, Emil Gensberger, and Theo Safier. What were they like?
I mean, they were young men, of course, in their 20s. Gensberger, Safier had just come back from Europe, and they were were showing off all of the clothes that they bought in places like Monte Carlo. But these were young men that were stockbrokers, that were bankers. They were the movers and shakers within the community in Shanghai. Their parents were very wealthy, having come to Shanghai probably 2 to 3 decades before, but built up businesses in ways that, with the Elias brothers, their roots on the paternal side were the Sephardic Jews from Baghdad. Mm-hmm. And their father was he ran a business of providing supplies for the ships, not just commercial ships, but he supplied the Navy ships, such as the British, as well as the Russians, as well as the Japanese. He supplied anybody that wanted supplies and made a fortune as a provisioning agent. So the Elias brothers and Gensberger, Safier, those cousins were, part of the movers and shakers in the communities. But interesting, the Elias brothers, they're on the paternal side, was the Sephardic Jews, but on the mother's side, they were the Haimovich. So their mother was Irene Haimovich, and Haimovich cousins, that's what we were talking about, the Shanghai cousins, they were all intermarried. But the Haimovich were actually originally from Ukraine, and then they actually were not of wealth, and they came across the Haimovich family came across Siberia by way of a combination of railroad, as well as a combination of basically like pioneer carts and horses, made their way to Vladivostok, and the Haimovich family was musicians, and so they had they would sell musical instruments, and so Irene Haimovich actually moved to Shanghai along with the family, married into the Elias family. So it was a combination of the Sephardic as well as the Ashkenazi Jewish families, where you saw the integration, in a way that was very typical of Shanghai. Because before the 1920s, the families did not integrate as much, but as you saw more and more migration from Russia or from the U.S., you had more integration of the two types of Jewish cultures, and they actually had their own different synagogues as well as. But the Elias family was more of a hybrid, of families, but very, very, very successful. And these young men were boarding the train because Victor Heimovich, cousin Victor, was a pony racer. He raced horses, and he was on his way to Tianjin to race in the big polo races in Tianjin. Back then, horse racing was a big deal. I mean, you didn't have internet, you didn't have TV and so forth, so you went to the horse races. So the cousins, plus their friend, Alfred Zimmerman, and Victor Heimovich, they were all on their way to watch Victor compete in the races. And so this was actually the Elias brothers, they had never been to Tianjin. And so this was a real big deal for them to go from Shanghai and then make their way up to Tianjin. It was a holiday for them. But the group they were considered within all of the hostages that were eventually taken. The Elias brothers and Gensberger and Safier were viewed as the creative ones, the ones that wanted to entertain. They wanted to sing and dance, because they actually, in the book, throughout the book, there's mention where they entertained people on the train, as well as they were the ones doing the singing and dancing when they were actually, held hostage. So they were young men, and they were on this trip to have fun. But getting caught up in this, there was 4 that ended up becoming hostage. Victor Heimovich, as well as Alfred Zimmerman, were able to escape. And their escape was very, very daring, very exciting for them. But the fact that they were able to escape was extraordinary in itself. But the cousins themselves were enjoyed their togetherness when they on this trip.
So there were 100 people taken prisoner once the train was derailed in the middle of the night. I'm not going to give you too many spoilers because it's such a great book and I want you to read it for yourselves. But 100 people taken hostage, 28 of which were foreigners. Some of them were Jewish. Obviously, there were a lot of other movers and shakers on the train, like Powell and that whole group. A very interesting group, which is really sort of a microcosm of Shanghai at that time. So you have these Jewish people within this group. How were they treated and viewed by the other foreigners that were taken hostage?
They were treated, quite well. In fact, the makeup of the group of the hostages towards the end, there was at least 7 were Jewish, and that was out of the final 12 to 13 were Jewish. Now, the question to me was, that I've heard is, well, did the bandits target, the Jewish hostages? No, I don't think they even, really looked at that as an issue. It was more of a reflection of the diversity of people within the community in Shanghai. And they were treated well by the others. In fact, the lawyer who was also a hostage, G.D. Musso, who was actually Roman Catholic, he was very, very close with a lot of the Jewish families because he, as a lawyer, represented them in a lot of different ways. And you found that the foreigners actually stuck together, and were in some respects a bit critical of some of the Chinese captives, that really did not band together, did not organize as well as the the foreign hostages from Shanghai, but you had you found a lot of even the bandits got along very well with the Jewish hostages. In fact, at least 2 of the bandits went to work for, the Jewish hostages after. Leon Friedman hired one, and Lee Solomon hired another bandit. And so, back, 1920s, they did the term, Stockholm Syndrome was not around. That was something from the 70s. But it was something that was a phenomenon, clearly, that, the hostages really were close with a number of the bandits, and some of it, especially the older bandits that were more mature, more disciplined. The bandits that were causing issues were, for the most part, the younger, child bandits that were very undisciplined. But, to answer your question, there was in some respects bonding between some of the hostages and Jewish hostages and the bandits, and then all of the foreign hostages got along very, very well. And they all stuck together very, very well. There was issues with food, of course, but they had to pretty much, eat what they were provided with. On that point too, because the rescue mission was sending up provisions. There were some of the Jewish families that were able to send some things up that we know of to supplement some of the food that they were getting.
My favorite line in the book, and there were very many favorite lines, but my absolute favorite line was Leon Friedman's line about we're starving and they serve us ham. We have nothing to read and they give us the New Testament. What's a Jewish guy to do? I love that line so much. All I could think of is, had I been of age in the 20s in Shanghai, I would have fallen in love with this guy. He was just a great character.
He was amazing, and on top of that, the ham was actually sent up by the Presbyterian mission in that area, and they didn't. You can imagine a Presbyterian mission not having a whole lot of books to read, and so they're like, well, let's send up some New Testaments, So, but Leon Friedman, the day he got back to Shanghai, he sent checks to both the Catholic priests as well as the Presbyterian mission in the area of what's called Zhaozhuang that were sending whatever food they had. And quite frankly, there's a whole story behind the pig that they sent up, because it was Shandong ham, which they characterize as being really gamey. So it's pretty bad. But that's all they had. And so that food is what they sent up from the missions. But Leon, his whole life was one of charity,
Sounds like a
and
great
for
guy.
him, the most important thing he could do when he got back to the safety of where he lived and worked in Shanghai was to send checks up. And as I remember, the dollar amount was at that time $500 each, which in today's dollars would be $7,000. So he really sent a lot of money to both of these missions as a showing of gratitude in providing. So it is a great line, though. It's pretty funny. It's like, what is a good Jew boy to do? They said that we're starving and they send us a ham. We have nothing to read and they send the New Testament. So it is a really great line. But
So they were kept hostage for 37 days at the Temple of the Clouds, some of them at the plateau. How did they occupy their time?
well, with the Alliance brothers, and just so you know, they were given the nickname for the Shanghai Cousins. They were called the Feet Club. Okay, Feet standing for Freddie, Eddie, Emile, and Theo. So, and the part of that nickname was because they were always on their feet, entertaining everyone. I mean, this is the Temple of the Clouds, and there's one photo of this mountain. And let me just take a show of hands. How many people have climbed to the top of Paozuku? Oh, there's someone back there. That happens to be my daughter. And she and I actually climbed the top on May 6th and 7th, which was the 100th anniversary of this incident. And when we get to that, you'll see this cone-shaped mountain, which is 94 stories tall, straight up, and they don't believe in switchbacks, so it's steps straight up. But anyway, and the base of that mountain is this temple of the Clouds, which is actually, the real name is called Sanqing Temple. It's a Taoist temple, and it is one of the most beautiful places in China, if not in the world. It's this gorgeous cut stone temple where the hostages were held. And I mean, it was a place of very quiet, very peaceful, very spiritual. And, you know, even those that were either Jewish or Roman Catholic or Protestant, you know, Buddhist, they found the place and wrote about it as being, very beautiful, and something in other circumstances it would be a fantastic place to visit. And then even today, there's a ginkgo tree that has been there for over 1,000 years. The same tree is there today as it was in 1923. But anyway, they kept themselves occupied in the temple by entertaining one another, by writing a lot of letters. One of the things in the process of setting up a rescue mission is that they had this like a postal system where in the writing process, for writing the book, there was thousands of letters that the hostages and the rescuers describing the situations and describing life in in this temple, which is just remarkable, to get a feel for what they were, how they lived for basically 37 days. But they were able to keep themselves occupied. They also would have campfires and talk politics. And those that talked politics the most were Gigi Musso, who was the Italian lawyer, who actually at the time was a big supporter of Mussolini. So 1923 it was actually, in some respects, politically correct to support Mussolini, but after the fact, it wasn't. But anyway, Gigi Musso would be talking politics. Leon Friedman would join in. Powell and all the others would join in as well. The Feet Club, the Elias brothers, the cousins, were off entertaining themselves, but they also were writing letters home, describing, the things. And they also, because there was newspapers being sent up, they were watching the stock markets. They were watching the price of commodities. They were keeping things going with their business. But they tried to stay as active as they could. Now, the cooks, those that did the cooking, were Leon Friedman and Lee Solomon. Those were the guys that cooked. Leon Friedman liked to cook mostly the heavy meats. And Lee Solomon was the guy that did more vegetable-based. So there was two different kind of camps. When people, would eat, they would say, "Oh, I want to go with Solomon. I've had too much, heavy pork or lamb or beef or whatever." And so, but Friedman was the guy that created what is called a scorpion roll. Basically, he was taking a Shandong pancake and barbecuing scorpions that were like shrimps. The tail of the scorpion came out. Actually, you boiled it and then you fried it. And so Leon Friedman actually invented the scorpion roll with chili peppers and all that. So that's actually part of the, a part of the side stories in the book. But they kept occupied as best as they could.
So speaking of religions, you had Jews there, you had Roman Catholics, you had Protestants, you had Taoists, you had everything. Did they discuss religion? Do you know? Was it a topic? Were there any issues?
They did, and they wrote about it. And there was a kind of a cross-section of discussions. One of the topics that's written mostly about was actually questioning some of the views of the Chinese, who kind of mixed their religions. Those that wrote were one of the hostages called Chichang, who was actually, he studied in Cambridge, and he came back to China a Christian, but he actually integrated his Chinese beliefs, things like, arranged marriages and the role of women in the family and all of that into his new, the Christianity that he was aware of from when he studied in Cambridge. So there was discussions about religion. Most of those that wrote about it were those that questioned, Chinese views of religion. But there was nothing in the records for the Shanghai cousins that I saw that they were much more differential to the Chinese. It was more of the Catholics and the Christians that questioned the Chinese views on their views on religion. But yeah, there was some discussions, but I think the spirituality part that I got from the writings of the Shanghai Cousins was how they felt that the presence in the temple in some respects was no different from being in a synagogue too. It was very, very peaceful. It was a time of reflection. It was a time of thinking about the families. It was a time of thinking about things, the mistakes that they made. And there was a lot of reflection about whether or not I'm going to see my family again. So, I mean, because these people, they were living on the edge, and they didn't know if they were going to live or die the next day. So there was a lot of that, personal reflection.
That was my next question about how intensely did they feel about their own mortality? Did they believe that Powell was going to be successful in negotiating on behalf of the hostages?
They were more concerned about the Chinese army in attacking, because that was always a concern, even with the bandits.
And while we're at it, can you please put us out of our misery and let us know if you were related to...
There's no relationship. No, not at all. I actually, the Zimmerman family in the story actually came from Ukraine. And then they eventually went to Vladivostok and then to San Francisco. And then they moved from San Francisco back to Shanghai. It's interesting because here's a family, the Zimmerman family, actually went to the U.S., but felt like there was more opportunities. And they just packed up and immediately went to Shanghai. And they actually were also musicians, like the Heimovich were. And so the Zimmerman family there, eventually after in 1949, when the communists took over the country, they left their businesses and actually went back to San Francisco. So in tracking that family down, they are based in the San Francisco area. But no, I'm not related to the Zimmermans.
So tell us about the escape. So there were two people that escaped almost immediately after the train derailed.
So Victor Heimovich and Alfred Zimmerman were in the first-class car. Just a little bit, when the train was attacked, what happened was it was derailed. The train was derailed by the bandits. 1,000 bandits, led by a bandit chief by the name of Sun Miao, attacked the train. And they did so in waves. They focused mostly on the first class and second class cars because they wanted to get the foreign hostages. They ignored the third class cars, which were mostly, the third class, the Chinese, where the bandits did not see them as having any ransom value. Not from an economic perspective, just so you know that this was not about money. It was more of a political agenda. The bandits themselves, what their agenda was to force the central government to recognize the bandit chief and his army as the army in southern Shandong, and to get the warlords out, because there was constant fighting between the warlords and Sun Miao's army. So it was more of a social agenda, political agenda, not an economic agenda. So anyway, when they derailed the train, they attacked in waves. The first wave went through and took the jewelry and took the watches and so forth, and they used that to buy ammunition from the corrupt Chinese army. All right, and so that was the first wave. The second wave is that they went through the train cars and took things like the blankets, the pots and pans, the clothing, the fixtures from the train, and they used that to buy safe passage with the villagers. So they could barter blankets with the villagers as they went 30-something miles into the countryside. The third wave that attacked the train was taking hostages. And so what they did was they were focused on getting foreign hostages, and they wanted as many countries represented as possible. And eventually they had 5 countries. There was probably 10 different countries represented, but some people escaped. So at the end of it, they had French, Italian, American, and British, and Mexican. The Mexican interests were represented by the American embassy. But anyway, Victor Heimovich and Alfred Zimmerman were in a first-class car together. along with the Shanghai cousins as well. They were in the first class as well. And when the bandits attacked, they first came into the cars and took their jewelry, took their watches, because they came in rounds. Bandits would come in, take all the jewelry, and then they would leave. And so Victor and Alfred were sitting there after they came in, took their jewelry, took their money, and then they're standing there and they go, okay, now what? And they're looking at each other, and then they hear screaming of women, of children being dragged off the train, and a lot of gunshots. And so Victor and Alfred said to themselves, they're shooting people. We can't, we have to get out of this. And so what they ended up doing, the wave of bandits that came into their car to take them hostage, they immediately attacked them. And Victor Heimovich, as well as Alfred Zimmerman, beat up the bandit that came into their car. And then they jumped out of the train and ran underneath the tracks and hid underneath the wheelbase while all of this was going on. And they eventually escaped, and both of them wrote about their experiences. But the fact that they escaped, they immediately, within the first few hours after they got to the closest train station, they actually sent telegrams to their uncles, Elias and Gensberger, and basically said, the rest of the cousins have been taken hostage. And so they were aware that they had an issue with the remaining cousins that were actually taken hostage.
So there was one foreigner who was killed as a result of the initial activity. So can you tell us a little bit about him?
This was Joseph Rothman, who was not a good soul. He was not a good person. He was someone that he had British citizenship, but he earned fighting in the Boer War in South Africa. And then after he left the military and then started roaming around Asia, he became what is called a crewing agent. And what a crewing agent does, and if you've heard of the term being shanghaied, okay, a crewing agent would go to bars or and saloons and taverns and locate men, and young men that were drinking, and either drug them or beat them up, and then he would supply them to ships, and basically kidnap. As a crewing agent, basically you've manipulated, or you by violence would take people and then you would provide them to ships that were in need of workers. That was his job. He was a notorious crewing agent. And it was so bad that he had been deported from Shanghai by the British intelligence. And the records with the British government said this guy was a really shady character. So anyway, he was on the train, but he also had with him, he had bags of money, a lot of money, and he also had 200 rounds of ammunition and 2 firearms. When the bandits came into his car, he decided that he was not going to give up his money, and ended up fighting back, and he was killed. Now, the interesting thing on this was that after he was killed, and he was actually ended up being, after the British did an inquest and they realized he had been shot point blank, and they buried him. The rabbi, Rav Hirsch in Shanghai, did him justice by requesting that the British, dig up his body and send his body to Shanghai or Tianjin for a Jewish burial. And the community in Shanghai did that for him, notwithstanding the fact that he was considered to be kind of a bad guy. So the fact that the Jewish community in Shanghai did that, I think, is remarkable in looking out for the interests, even of those that are, or that are Jewish. But he was a troubled soul, that was for sure.
So there was no indication that he was shot because he was Jewish, or that they even knew, or anything.
No,
okay.
No, not at all. There was no. And I don't think, in analyzing the Chinese bandits, because of their own diverse religious based. Some of them were Taoists, some of them were Buddhists, some of them were Christians. I think they had the Chinese in general had respect for, the religions, and that's something I think that, is even today. You find that, Chinese in general as a cultural is tolerant. So I don't. There was no attack on Joseph Rothman because he was Jewish. He was attacked because he pulled weapons on them, and the bandits were just not going to tolerate getting shot at. I mean, he was shooting, like point blank, and unfortunately, he was shot because, he had 6 guys coming into his car, and he was trying to fight them back. So, and that was unfortunate. Most of the other passengers realized that they couldn't fight because some of them had guns. Powell had a gun. He basically gave it up because he was outnumbered.
So the hostages were eventually released basically in a piecemeal fashion, with some of the women and children first, one of whom was an incredibly colorful character, Rockefeller's sister-in-law. She was quite fascinating to read about. But towards the end, they were left with 8 hostages. And they developed such an intense camaraderie that they had decided all 8 or none. And how do you account for that intense camaraderie where they were risking really their own lives because they didn't know if there would actually be resolution between the Chinese government and the bandits? How do you account for that high level of a camaraderie?
They realized towards the end that the bandits actually wanted to keep 3 hostages before security, and that troubled the final 8. And they really were, they saw themselves as having lived for 37 days together. And they were not going to just even the Chidi Musso, who was one of the most valuable, hostages, he was not going to leave early until everyone in his group were going to be released as well. So that the bond between those foreign hostages was pretty strong. Even 20, 30 years later, a lot of them remained friends. A lot of them stayed in communication, sent Christmas cards or sent, holiday cards to one another. Got together as family members. And so there was a strong bond for the final 8, actually for the final 15, 16, and so that was something that was very, very important for all of them. They also were a strong bond with some of the Chinese. Keep in mind there was 28 original foreigners and 75 Chinese that were taken hostage, and so some of the Chinese that were close, especially those that spoke English, were very close with the foreign hostages, and the foreign hostages would not leave unless some of the Chinese were allowed to leave as well, so they formed a very, very strong bond. You brought up a good point about Lucy Aldridge, because she was coming from very high wealth, New England, very strong politically. Her father was a senator from Rhode Island. Her brother was a congressman. She's a very, very wealthy lady. And she, in the story, in the book, I wrote how initially she was very arrogant. Very arrogant, basically telling the, bandits, go away, don't touch me. As she spent her time in the villages and saw how some of the village women were taking care of her, brushing her hair, cleaning her face, she just said, couldn't help but have empathy and have respect for all of these, villagers that were just trying to take care of her and help her. So she kind of went through a transformation of her thinking, being one of arrogant, oh, don't touch me, But anyway, a very impressive, very interesting lady in, getting caught up in this. But that's, when you're at the train station, in Shanghai, 300 passengers, and you've got languages you hear would be German, Italian, English, Spanish, and multiple Chinese dialects, a very, very diverse group. You had the Shanghai cousins. You had businessmen like Leon Friedman, Lee Solomon. You had honeymooners from Mexico. You had U.S. Army majors with their families. And if anybody has ever worked as expatriates overseas, one of the joys of being an expatriate is we live in one country, let's go see this other country. So these two Army majors with their wives and their kids, they're stationed in Manila, where there was a U.S. Army base at the time. But they say, let's go see China. And so they decide to take their kids through China. This is 1923 through bandit countries. So, but you had a very diverse group of people in there and remarkable backgrounds. Like Lee Solomon was someone that he started a company called Mei Ren, who made these mahjong sets. And I brought one over here. It's for show and tell. But Lee Solomon was a typical successful businessman who came to Shanghai and saw an opportunity, and that was, he employed 400 people to make mahjong sets for the export market, for the U.S. In the 20s, mahjong was a hit, was a big deal. And so, but so anyway, you had this remarkable group of people, of passengers, getting ready to board the train. So, but with different backgrounds and different things that, living extraordinary lives in Shanghai.
Did you come across any letters between spouses or between hostages and family members that you found particularly touching?
In reviewing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters, what I noticed that when letters were sent between, like a hostage and a spouse or other family members, father, mother, the tone was very, very different, and they very selective on what they said. Part of it was they didn't want their family members to worry, but letters between the hostages and business colleagues or the media or the government rescuers were to the point. We need to do this. We need very, very strong. But to answer your question, some of the letters to family, they reflected on the fact that their lives were on the line, and they expressed much, love and respect, that you would expect from a letter between a husband and wife, or between a brothers or family members. But you could see, and especially as time went on and things were dragging on and there were threats of the army attacking and so forth, there was a lot of expressions about that the hostages reflected in their letters. Absolutely. I mean, but it was funny when it was a completely different tone when they were writing letters to the rescuers, and basically saying, you got to get us out of here, you got to get us out of here. And it was there was less love in the letter and more direct to the point of you need to do this.
Writing to the audience. Yeah. So within the research that you did you find any overt signs of anti-Semitism?
Yes. And most of that was in, it was two characters that I saw a lot of that in. One was the British council that was assigned to the to manage the situation on behalf of the British government. His name was Bertrand Tours. And as a researcher and someone looking at things from 1923, I don't want to say you cut them slack, because I never cut them slack, but I'm just okay, that's the times. But I mean, it was just a horrible things that they were saying that was very, very disappointing for a government official. And quite frankly, in hindsight, to write that kind of stuff in the records can't be, it's just not even politically correct back in 1923. And one of the comments that I thought was really Mr. Tours Mr. Tours, being a typical colonial government official, took the view that certain people that he was responsible for were of lesser value than others. Like there was a true British national, and then there were the protected persons, like the Elias brothers were not British nationals at that point in their lives. In 1923, they had what was called protected person status, and it wasn't really citizenship, but it was a different kind of almost in limbo where they stood. But Tours he referred to the Shanghai Cousins as Babylonian Scotsmen from someplace coming from Mesopotamia.
Wow.
I mean, it's actually in the book. It's in a footnote. I actually felt like I had to bring this up, only because it's just a reflection of the attitude. It was a horrible thing to say. I mean, he was not only insulting those from Baghdad, but he was also insulting the Scots, from Scotland, I mean, it was just, but his attitude came out in his writing as well. And quite frankly, the American diplomats, the French diplomats, and the Italian diplomats kind of, shied away from him because he was just a loose cannon. But yes, there was some of that. And then there was other, there was a lot of comments that were anti-Semitic. It was really frustrating. But you have to read it, and I just can't, even in hindsight, justify why they would do that. You just can't. But it was there, and it was real, and whether they would, so it was very difficult to see that kind of thing, looking at it from, 100 years on, and knowing, and especially knowing some of the historical circumstances that took place after that. It's really something that just eats you up, anybody that reads it. And so I do mention it in the footnote only for historical context, and also to put in perspective, this is the guy that was representing the British government. There was also one other character, and that was Dr. Allen, who in his writings were very, very, it was very strong words about both Chinese, very racist towards Chinese, and very anti-Semitic towards those that were Jewish captives.
This was Dr. Allen's writings after the release? This is in his
wrote
memoirs?
In his diary.
Wow.
In his diary about the incident. And in the story, basically, I characterized Dr. Allen from reading all of his writings. He was not a happy man. He had a lot of anger inside of him, and he didn't enjoy his time in the U.S. Army. He was a medical doctor who was stationed in the Philippines and was unhappy because it was not wartime, and so most of the things he did in Manila when he was stationed there was basically treat exotic infectious diseases, and he got sick of that. He was like, he had a very negative view of his job, but in his comments, even in his diary, and the way he would talk about certain Jewish captives was it was disappointing to see that, but it just reflected him as a person. And that comes out in a lot of other writings too, because I characterize him as being someone that was a very negative person.
I have a final sort of stray question, just because I'm so personally curious about it. There were a number of Japanese passengers that exited the train shortly before the derailment. Did your research ever figure out whether they had some advanced warning about the bandits coming on the train?
They absolutely had advance warning. I mean, there was a lot of Japanese passengers on the train that got off at the last stop, and there's clearly evidence that they were warned. Now, the big question is whether or not the Japanese government, was involved. And the U.S. government actually did its own study and said, no, there's no direct evidence that the Tokyo government, the Japanese government, were involved in the crisis. However, there was ample evidence that there may have been Japanese business interests, gun runners, and so forth that supplied the bandits. But there's clear evidence that all the Japanese got off the last stop, and that's part of the story and part of the intrigue of the whole thing.
Well, this is such a wonderful book, and I have 2,000 more questions, but I'm going to stop now. And if anyone in the audience has some questions, then we'll take some questions now. I think I'll stand and give you the microphone. Let me pass it here.
Thanks. I have a lot of questions, but one, I have a really like a logistical question. How did the post office work? I mean, you're talking about all these letters that went back and forth. I just can't imagine they were going and standing and buying their yopiao or whatever, and, and sending their letters off to Shanghai or the U.S. or whatever.
Well, what had happened is the situation went on more than a couple of days, and the bandits themselves realized that they did not have the food, for 28 foreigners and 75 Chinese, and then for the first week they were eating basically what they could get from the villagers, which wasn't much. And in the story, they were eating local dog and raven and so forth. And so there was, and that's why Leon Friedman said, "We're starving. They send us a ham." So there was clearly an issue with that. And so the U.S. actually asked Carl Crow. Okay, Carl Crow was a well-known publisher in China to lead the American Rescue Mission. And Carl Crow actually was the Shanghai representative for the American Red Cross. And so he took it upon himself to lead the rescue mission. And so what they did is that the foreign community in Shanghai and Peking and whatever, they were supplying food, provisions, and so forth that were being sent up by what is called this is not a politically correct description, but it was called by the Coolie Express. All right, and so what they were doing was sending up, and there's several photos in the book where they were sending up on backs of the men. They had a pole between the two of them, and they were sending up provisions every day. Now, that went on for the entire duration of the crisis. Yeah, primarily for sending food and water. They sent up bottled water, and they were doing it twice a day. Then they thought, okay, let's send up reading material and let's send up, letters. And so letters were going back and forth. And there's in the files hundreds and hundreds of letters. Now, Carl Crow himself, as a joke, created some stamps. And so if anybody has read the book, they'll know that Carl Crow created what is called the Bandit Post. And these were stamps that were fake stamps. And they were used to, as a joke, basically Crow said to the hostages, we're tired of carrying your mail for free. You need to have stamps on your letters. And so these fake stamps were used. Now, this is a whole side story, but the stamps themselves were a phenomenal story in the world of stamp collecting. I mean, to this day, and these are replicas of the two stamps, the red one and the white one. They had pictures of the mountain on them, but these stamps were issued by Carl Crow, and it was just when the coolies were carrying bundles up, they would bring the mail down. So it was something and it was done. I mean, it was very, very efficient, twice a day, and mail was going up and down. Now, it was such a big deal that the Chinese government themselves, and this is on May 6th, they issued an envelope with stamps that shows the Bandit Post stamps. And there's a picture of the mountain. This was issued by the Chinese government, and it's only a limited edition. We got 1,000 of these were issued for the entire country. But anyway. But the stamps themselves and the whole postal process was very, very efficient. And that actually, for myself, in writing the book, the family letters was an amazing resource of information. But the stamps became a big deal. And today, these two stamps, stamp collectors are selling them for $10,000 each, and they're not even real stamps. They're just, and so it's kind of a kind of an interesting issue if you're in the business of stamp collecting.
But interestingly enough, the Postal Service then in 1923 up that mountain was far more efficient than it is today, but that's another story.
Hi, Jim. Congratulations on the book, and it's a great story. Thanks so much, and good talk. I'm wondering, in China, not necessarily regarding your book, but in China, is this story known? I've asked some of my Chinese friends, and not too many people have heard of it. And then secondly, is your book banned in China, or is it for sale?
It's the story. I mean, the interesting thing is when I started going down to Zhaozhuang in southern Shandong in 2015, and the collective memory there was like, they don't even remember 1920, 1923. They don't even talk about bandits at all. Everything in that area is to talk about the Japanese. So the story itself is not that well known. However, it was the subject of academic discussions in China as to whether the bandit chief Sun Miao was a hero or not. And the Chinese Institute of Military Sciences actually did a big study and determined that he was not a hero. But having said that, when the book came out, the local party officials called my office and they said, this is wonderful. So they issued the stamps, and then on the weekend of the 100th anniversary, May 6th and 7th, I was in Shandong with my daughter Elise, and we did a media tour there. The local government had put on a banquet, and it was kind of fun. So they are now latching on to the story in ways, not just issuing the envelopes, but they're very supportive in embracing this as a way to drive tourism, because that mountain, the temple, is just fabulous. But anyway, we went to this banquet, and one of the guests of honor was the grandnephew of Sun Miao, the bandit chief. So, and I actually met him for the first time. When I was doing the research in 2015 and earlier, I was trying to get through to these guys, and they were not interested, but now they are. So anyway, during the banquet, I asked questions about, what was the family stories that he heard about Sun Miao, the bandit chief. And he's like, well, Sun Miao was a man of the people. He was well educated. He didn't need to lead the bandits. His place was secure in the community as it was. And so, but when I asked the question, was Sun Miao, do you consider Sun Miao to be a hero? He all of a sudden, that's getting too off track with the official, version of the story. So and you could even see the government officials in the discussion. They didn't want to talk about whether he's a hero or not. But anyway, to answer your questions, the story is now getting traction, and in ways. And the book, I'm in the process of getting the Chinese version, to be published, which should take time. It is available in English. Now, when it first came out, the book was released in early April. I was told by the importers that it could not come into the market because it was history and politics. Basically, I was told forbidden. All right. And then shortly after that, all of a sudden, it's for sale. It's in the market. And so in conversations with the importer, I find out that the importer is importing this in as science and technology. I mean, it's a train story. Oh, okay. Right, so we get it. It's science and technology. So it's on the market. It's available in China. It's at Garden Books in Shanghai. And you can buy it on what's called JD.com, Dandan, and different platforms. But pricing is wild. I mean, it's been as low as 200 kwai, which is about $30, up to 850 kwai, which is close to $150 for the book. And I tell people, don't pay $150 for the book. I'll lend you my copy, before you pay that much. But because of the restrictions on the imports, the pricing is just crazy. But it is getting into the market. And so the story idea, at least in Shandong, they see this as a way of driving tourism. And I also noticed that when I was there on the 5th and 6th of this year, 5th and 6th of May, they started to post things about the incident. And then I got photos about 3-4 weeks ago where they actually put up stone carvings that tell the story of Sun Miao. So they're more and more embracing it. And again, it's for tourism. It's really going to be driving tourism for that area.
Any other questions?
How is it that there are so many records available 100 years later, and how did you access all those records?
It was amazing what the families collected, and there are records, of course, in government archives, but a real wealth of documents, especially the letters that go back and forth between the hostages and the rescuers and family members, are in the family files. The family files, that like the Pinger family. He has Major Pinger, who is a character in the book. He created a 175-page diary of the 37-day incident. So just imagine. This guy is trained as an engineer, so he's very meticulous about every single thing that he sees and observes, and so. But the records, the family records, are just amazing. One of the most interesting finds that I found in the Anderson family, in a farmhouse in western Massachusetts, is the original agreement between Roy Anderson, the negotiator, and the bandits. This is not in Chinese archives. This is in somebody's personal records, So it's just amazing. It's amazing what the families have.
And what languages? Is it multiple languages?
That is in Chinese. The agreement between the bandits and Roy Anderson is in Chinese. And so the records, the family records, of the foreign hostages are mostly in English. Some of them it can be in French, and some of them in Italian, but yeah, different languages. But specifically if it's if the hostage was from France, their letters were in French. But yeah, there was a tremendous amount of family records there that are still there. And my message to the families is this stuff is so valuable from a researcher's perspective. It's got to go into archives, And there was a family in Chicago for one of the rescuers that has original photographs. The Pingers have what had happened during the crisis. The wives of Major Pinger and Lee Solomon sent cameras up to the bandit camp, and they took photographs after photographs. And these are photographs that have never seen. Some of these things that you see have never been published. So my suggestion for anyone that wants to write a story about people in the past is trace the families, because you would be just amazed as what's in family records and what's passed on, family after generation after generation after generation.
Any other questions? Yep.
Was the hostage taking a robbery gone bad?
He's asking if the
hostage taking a robbery that had just gone bad, or was it
he's asking if the hostage taking was a robbery gone bad.
Was it?
No, it wasn't really.
No, it was not a robbery. It was not a robbery in the sense of there was no economic reason for the holdup. It was more of a political agenda. What had gone, what was not planned was the length of time. The bandit chief thought that this was going to be a one-day affair. And in fact, when they escaped from the train, they went to initial mountain, like holdout, and they had sent a runner down to the telegraph office to send a telegraph to Peking and saying, these are our terms. Well, that messenger never made it. The army stopped him and shot him, and so the bandit chief thought this thing was going to last a day. And so he ended up having to run across the countryside as the army was pursuing them. And that's what's one of the exciting things about the story, is that, going across the countryside and in pursuit of by a corrupt Chinese army is, part of the story. But I would not characterize this as a robbery gone bad, because I think they ultimately got what they wanted. And without spoiling it, after the hostages were released, things happened. Happened to one of the negotiators, happened to the bandits, and the things that happened, it didn't end well for some of the people. But I think it was successful in a lot of ways. It was successful in the fact that it got the political message out. One, two, it was successful for Mao, because 2 years after this incident, Mao himself raised this as an example of how poor peasants are fighting back against the warlords. So it was part of Mao's messaging. Where it was not successful, and why the title of the book says it broke, the Republic of China. It weakened the Republic of China government, in that the issue of what's called extraterritoriality was not resolved. It's just a little background on that. After the Opium Wars, the treaties that were negotiated by the British, Americans with the Chinese allowed for what are called extraterritorial courts. And so British nationals, American nationals were exempt from local courts. They were exempt from local taxation. These extraterritorial privileges were an insult to the Chinese, and they wanted these reversed. And in 1923, there was a plan for a commission that was to meet in November of 1923 to pull back on extraterritoriality. It didn't happen. And extraterritoriality remained until World War II. So it was considered to be a violation of Chinese sovereignty, an embarrassment to the Chinese. And so the fact that extraterritoriality existed for another 20 years was something that was highly damaging for the Republican government, but also it strengthened Mao, because all Mao turned and said, see, the imperialists are not leaving.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
Good evening. Thank you so much for inviting all of us. It's so good to see so many wonderful people. You talked a lot about some of the Jewish men who were hostages. Were there any Jewish women?
No, there was, but that's a good question, because and this will take a little bit of research too. There was one woman that was truly a hero throughout all of this affairs, and she was Teresa Vieira. She was on her honeymoon with her husband, and she was the only woman that absolutely refused to leave her husband's side. She ended up staying the duration of the crisis until about the last week, when she was finally left, the bandit camp. But she was definitely a hero in the story. Part of it was because Teresa Vieira also assisted or encouraged the Chinese, the bandits, to release some of the Chinese girls that were taking on as wives for some of the bandits. So Teresa was clearly a hero. Now, whether she was Jewish or not is something that we'll take further research. In my research, she came from a family from Germany, and I know she married into a Catholic family, but I do believe that her roots are from a Jewish family in Germany. But that's something that I tried to research all the way back, and her family was the Kuhnhardt family, originally from Germany. And so, but anyway, no, but she was definitely female and was a hero in the story. But I'm not sure whether or not she has Jewish roots or not, and that's something that I could not. In my research, I was able to get as much of the family records as I could, but most of those were on the husband's side.
Well, that's our time for this evening, but our heartfelt thanks to you so much for showing us.
I want one final comment, though, that I want to bring to your attention is that you have to imagine in 1923 when you're in the train station with the 300 people and got your family with you, or you're with your cousins, and you overhear somebody say, "Hey, we're going through bandit country." And then someone says, "Don't worry, I've got my Carl Crow Handbook for China here." And now, this is kind of like the Lonely Planet Guide, from 1923. But, what does Carl Crow in 1923 say about bandits? Okay. He says, and keep in mind, this is the book everybody's got, and they're saying, we're going through bandit country. Let's see what Carl Crow says. He goes, "All in all, travel is as safe in China as in any other part of the world. Robbers and pirates exist, of course, and there is usually a revolution or rebellion going on in some part of the country. But these things add zest rather than danger to the journey." So that's what they were reading when they boarded the train on May 5th, 1923.
In the height of luxury. Thank you again very much. Buy your book. You will not regret it.